So thank you very much for coming to tonight's webinar. My name is Jeff Greenswag. I'm a level 3 certified cannabis sommelier. We call ourselves interpeners. It's interpreting terpenes, and I'm bringing the level 1 program out to Michigan, as you know, because you're here at the webinar and you're interested in finding out a little more. And I really appreciate that. I really appreciate you coming. Coming out to Michigan, February 2nd, 3rd, and 4th. I think we're doing Detroit, Grand Rapids, and Lansing. Going to be at the Lansing market, kind of a pre-Super Bowl class. So maybe we'll have a Super Bowl before the Super Bowl. That would be kind of fun. But to get going, I'm going to share my screen with you and dive into this presentation to introduce myself again real quick for the new people, talk a little bit about the program and what we're going to cover today. And again, if you have any questions, feel free to type them in the chat box there or in the Q&A section. And once I get through the presentation, I'll go ahead and take time to answer everybody's questions, and we'll make sure that y'all get what you need out of this program to make a good decision moving forward. So let me share the screen here, get this going. All right, can everyone see that all right? Looks good. And we will go play slideshow. All right, everybody. So the title of this program is From Connoisseur to Sommelier, Taking Your Cannabis Knowledge to the Next Level with Cannabis Interpreting. We call it the, Cannabis Sommelier Experience, or the art of the Cannabis Sommelier is interpreting. And what interpreting is interpreting terpenes, right? So it's a combination of those words. So we have interpreting. What today's program is going to cover is, what the need for interpreting is. And then after we kind of cover why we need interpreting and what's so important about it, and putting the power in your hands to make informed decisions and know what you're looking at, regardless of what it's labeled. And then we'll take a look into what interpreting is via bud structure, which is just one of many different factors that we look at when interpreting a bud. So for those of you who don't know, a sommelier is a trained and knowledgeable wine professional who specializes in pretty much all aspects of wine service, as well as food and wine pairing. Sommeliers, these are wine professionals. These people are really amazing. They have the ability, the best ones, to, look at a glass of wine, smell it, taste it, and they can tell you where on earth it was grown, what varietal it is, who the winemaker is, and probably even what year it was made and whether or not it was a good year. We don't really have that in cannabis because not a lot of cannabis is actually grown in the ground and subject to the conditions of the earth. Most of the industry is done in warehouses, and it's done to control the process and make things simple, which we totally understand. That being said, when you're interpreting and you are a cannabis sommelier, you are learning how to, and you are using your sight and your scent to gauge cannabis safety, quality, and indica sativa ratio in order to predict the psychotropic effects before you consume. Here I am smelling some cannabis. This is back at my time at the Trichome Institute. And, being an interpreter and going through this program can lead to a lot of really cool opportunities. And one is that I get to grade cannabis at the Dope Cup, 3 or 4 times a year. And basically this was a little post-dinner session that I did where I had to smoke, I think about 20 different strains and rate them for smoothness, burnability, and flavor. And here's kind of a little time lapse of that. So, you can see that it's not all fun and games. We're not all just smoking pot, there's a lot of work. I'm doing a lot of data entry, and it takes a long time to get through all those strains. But when it gets down to it, and you have all these different disciplines, the Cicerone, the Monger, the Cupper, for beer, cheese, and coffee, none of them are as important as interpening, because just like those, we're talking about the quality. I call it the pinky up approach, right? So when you want to be, talking about A plus and the best of the best weed, I mean, listen, even though I know the best of the best doesn't mean I can always afford the best of the best. So sometimes I got to buy working man's weed just like everyone else. That's why, I buy PBR instead of craft beers all the time. It's about what you can afford, what does the trick, what you need at a certain time. And what's so important about interpreting is we also deal with the medical effect of the product and what time of day this should be taken as medicine based on the effects it's going to provide, from sedating to uplifting. So that's why interpreting is so much more important than even being a sommelier, a cicerone, a monger, or a cupper. Now, you might be wondering, well, if I'm not going to be a professional or whatever, like what's the need for interpreting? And the bottom line is something that we like to call the strain name dilemma. And basically, the black market forced cannabis cultivators underground for decades. And as a result, people were hesitant to share. There's a lot of competition. Things were done secretly. Things were stolen, and names were changed, and all sorts of things happened without being able to really track any of the genetic lineages outside of maybe within one farm. But across the whole industry, there's no way to track any of this. And the result was a lot of really distinct, yet unknown cannabis genetics. No one really knew exactly what these things were, except maybe a handful of people. And at the end of the day, that's just not good enough when we're talking about using cannabis medicinally. And now at the retail level, what we're talking about with legal industries, we want to know what we're getting, and we want to be able to get that again if we really liked it. And so unfortunately, for reasons that are pretty obvious, when the legal cannabis industry started, the plants had to come from somewhere. And all of these plants that were mixed up and crazy got into the cannabis industry, the legal cannabis industry. And further complications include, things like cannabis morphology, counterfeiting, and the law, which is just things that we have to deal with. And it's, the question is, when I look at this jar of cannabis, when I see Purple Dream, it's like, how do I know that that's Purple Dream, right? Well, cannabis morphology is a problem with that, right? Because if you're not aware, cannabis is an incredibly adaptive plant, and one of the ways that we grow it is by taking clones and taking cuttings of a plant. And when we take a clone of a plant, it's genetically identical to the plant from which it came. So if you have a really strong plant that's growing in California in the ground, and it's sun grown, and you take a cutting of it and you take it to the Northeast and you grow it in a warehouse in the middle of winter, and there's cold air and there's cold water and all these different things, I mean, the plant can express itself completely differently. So even though you would have two genetically identical plants, because of the growing environments, they grow completely differently. And the best example that I have of this for you to look at now, if you're on Instagram, go check out a feed or a user, I forget, a handle. Sorry, I'm new to Instagram. Go check out the Grow Off. The Grow Off is a competition run by some people I know in Denver. And what they do is they get one cultivator to supply genetically identical clones of one plant to a bunch of different cultivators that want to try and see who the best grower is, right? So all these different people have the exact same plant to start with, and it's up to them to grow it as good as possible. And they have pictures of all 40 entries that came through, and a lot of the buds look wildly different from one another, and it's easy to see how they could be considered different plants, different products at the end of the day, because they were grown in different fashions. So that's one of the issues that's interpreting is taken care of. The other issue it's taken care of is counterfeiting. In fashion, fake handbags, fake jewelry, all these things. It's a $461 billion a year industry. And I know it happens in the cannabis industry. I know bud tenders that were working in Colorado in 2009, and they would buy cannabis off the streets from people that knocked on their back door, and they wouldn't even know what it was called necessarily, so they would have to give it a name. And whatever it was, or whatever it was supposed to be, and not what it is now. You know, imagine if somebody found a seed in one of those and then took it and grew it and called it something else because it was their seed. You know, I mean, these problems proliferate with each generation, and generations happen every 3 or 4 months when you're growing indoors. So, you know, over 30, 40 years, there have been a lot of opportunities for these mix-ups to happen. Now, what's being done to solve this problem? Well, on one hand, you know, some companies are searching for legal protection for their genetics. I believe Gorilla Glue got a copyright on their genetics for the strain, and now they can go and see if somebody is growing their strain without their permission. One of the ways they can do that is through a company like Phylos Bioscience. These are a really cool company. We're going to watch a video from them in a second. But what Phylos does is they take samples of cannabis plants and they do DNA analysis of it, and they get the genetic sequence, and then that genetic sequence is mapped in relation to all the other genetic sequences that they have analyzed. And the result is this kind of galaxy universe looking thing with all these stars, these points, and each point is a unique plant that was grown. And sometimes you get clusters, which means that people who have grows all around are actually growing the same plant, and some of them are called the same thing and some of them aren't, and we'll see a little bit more about that. Now, what you can do at home, if you're shopping in a robust cannabis industry like you are in Michigan, and you see a strain that you like and it comes from a cultivator that you like, and that cultivator has that strain, you can pretty much rest assured that every time you run into that cultivator, that strain is going to be that strain, right? But if that cultivator doesn't have that strain one day and you get that same strain name from somebody else, it might not actually be that. So be careful. And the way to know for sure is to learn interpreting. And, you know, that's what you guys are here to find out a little bit about.
So if you go online, it's just this three-dimensional map. You can zoom around in it. You can play with it. You can search for things. And now different growers and different dispensaries have their own constellations in there. Some dispensaries are finally starting to send letters to their suppliers saying, if you want to have stuff in our store, you have to get it tested because we want our patients to know what they're getting. So the idea was kind of that we would be able to build this huge data set and answer some really difficult questions if we could solve a market problem, if we could create a demand for consistency or meet the demand for consistency. And it's working. People are sending us tons of samples. Those samples aren't the rare, interesting ones. They're the industry samples. And so we're trying to tease apart all that mess. And the bigger the data set gets, the more we can tell people with certainty what they really have. These are just the names that everything came in with. We can see that at least 30% of the names are wrong or nonsensical, but people are already starting to log on and change the names. People send us samples of different things often, and we find out that actually they have the same thing. People are using it to settle disputes even, which I'm not sure how I feel about, but you can definitely do kind of a, you know, like a DNA paternity test and figure out, you know, if your buddy really took a cutting from you and is selling it in Washington State or not. You can figure that out. So one problem with this data inherently is that it's just complicated data. So if you zoom in on certain parts of the galaxy and you turn on all the relationship lines, you can't even see some of the names. Like, it's so dense. Like, this is the actual data. The dots are separated by genetic distance. The lines are first degree relationships, either parent-child or sibling-sibling. And there's so many varieties that it's such a tangle. And the reason for that is that there's no such thing as a strain. So people talk about seed lines and clonal lines. And there are clonal varieties. If you have a plant that's good and you take cuttings from it, all of those cuttings will be genetically identical. That's a variety. But in normal agriculture, people have made genetically stable plants. And all our children are the same. No one's ever done that for cannabis. So when you cross a male and a female cannabis plant, The seeds that you get are unique individuals, just like all of us. They are as different from each other as you are from your siblings. So all of these dots are individuals. They're not strains. It's just one plant. It's genetically, so every plant is its own special snowflake with its own crazy chemical diversity. So it's just a really, really complicated data problem. So here in Israel, as we learned in the last couple of days, they have this weird insistence on doing things correctly. And so they actually are doing experiments to figure out what's in the plant and how does it work. We can't do that in the United States because research is still basically illegal. So what we're doing is collecting tons and tons of data. We're comparing it with patient data and chemical data. There's this massive nationwide experiment going on, and hundreds of thousands of people are using this plant. So ultimately, we're going to be able to not just figure out what are you smoking, but we're going to be able to figure out what genes control what traits, and ultimately, we're going to be able to figure out what genes and traits are related to what patient outcomes by mining all that data. And that's it.
So that's pretty cool. And I highly recommend you guys check out Phylos Bioscience. You can just Google them. It's fun to play around with that map. But real quick, we're going to dive into interpening with bud structure. Going to kind of cover some of the good and the bad. And then we'll open it up for some questions and see what you guys think. So in order to explain this to you, I kind of want to cover some plant basics and explain how leaf structure and plant structure are both, they both become the way they are as a result of the growing environment. And nodal spacing, which is the space between branches and opportunities for buds to grow, is a result of the plant structure, and the bud structure is a result of the nodal spacing. So that's kind of how we're going to dive down into bud structure here. And something that's really interesting, if you talk to some growers and some commercial grows, even if they're growing wildly varying different strains, over time, those generations will end up kind of taking on the same characteristics if they're all grown in the same way. And it just kind of creates a lack of diversity. So I really believe the best grows, separate different plants into different rooms and provide to them the needs that they require individually. But if we look at this map, we can kind of see where cannabis comes from, roughly. Ruderalis kind of comes from all way up north where the light cycles are all crazy and it has to auto flower. You got your sativas that come from some of the more desert and arid and open and some of the mountainous regions, and then you got your indicas coming from a lot of the jungle regions. And what that results in is different plant shapes. Excuse me. You've got your indica plants that are really short and bushy, your sativa plants that are tall and open and wispy. The indica leaves are really broad and the sativa leaves are really narrow. And there's reasons for that, and this is all what we're talking about with the growing environment. So think about growing in a jungle. You're an indica plant growing in a jungle. There's a ton of other plants around. You're competing for space. You're competing for light. There's a canopy of trees. I was watching Planet Earth the other day. Only like 3% of the light from the sky gets through the canopy to the floor of the jungle. So that's why I had to have these really big, broad leaves, right? That's like the plant's solar panels. So it has to have big, broad leaves so it can catch as much light as possible. And the plant's got to be compact and really bushy and tucked together because there's just not a lot of room to grow. Same thing for sativas, just different conditions. It's open, it's airy, there's a lot of wind going around, it's getting beat down with the sun. So the leaves are really thin, and sometimes they're turned in a way that they don't catch any light at all. And, the plant is open and wispy and has room to stretch out, and the buds don't all stack up on top of each other like they do on an indica plant. And as a result, you've got this nodal spacing here where the indica plant on the left is really, really closely spaced, and you can see how the buds would have to grow in tight spaces. And on the right, you've got your sativas where, the buds have more room to stretch out and more room to breathe. And they can kind of grow open and airy. And it's obvious to see why the buds take the shape that they do eventually. So if you look here, this is an example of some indica bud from a cultivator here in Illinois called Green Thumb Industries. This is their kosher kush. Really dense, small little nuggets, and then moving on to an indica dominant hybrid, it's still pretty dense, but it's kind of starting to open up a little bit. More of a hybrid there, starting to open up a little more, the alien purple kush. And continuing on, some lime skunk, sativa opening up, Bedford grow, OG chem, even more conical, more reaching. And so, it's easy to see how these bud structures, come from the different plants. So like dense and round out to open and reaching. And as you go through them, that's kind of how the indica sativa spectrum looks from a bud structure perspective. But in addition to being able to tell the indica sativa ratio approximately, you can also use interpening to determine whether or not the bud is bad, right? So malformed cannabis is a sign that there's stress in the growing process, and there's a lot of opportunities for stress. Most cultivators are actually trying to stress the plant out a little bit, because then it produces more trichomes, it produces more energy for the trichomes, that produces more THC and terpenes, and makes the plant more powerful in its chemical war defenses. And those stresses include the lighting, the temperature, the humidity, the carbon dioxide levels, the nutrients, the soil mix, any insects or diseases that it's subject to. And so when things get bad, you can have faulty bud structure. On the left here, when we cut this bud off of a plant, it was one bud. By the time it dried and cured, it fell apart because it couldn't even hold itself together. On the right, you've got a bud that couldn't even form properly. It has, it wanted to cone out and then it shot out again, and it's just very unhealthy looking. So when you start seeing faulty buds, you can probably assume that it was grown poorly. It's going to be really harsh when you consume it. There's probably nutrients locked inside of there. It was not flushed well, probably, and just a host of other problems. So that's kind of a look at interpening with bud structure. And throughout level 1 interpening, we're going to learn a ton of things. We're going to talk about the cannabis basics, indica sativa ruderalis, the controversy, what is actually happening with genetics of plants. We'll talk some more about trichomes and their components, how those actually work, how cannabinoids grow and how terpenes grow in plants. And we'll talk all about how to break down the quality and indica sativa ratio by observing both the visual and scent-based characteristics. So, if you're interested in doing something like this, you might have heard of level 2 interpening, where you get to go to Colorado and you get to see and smell all the different samples. And that's a really cool program. And level 1 is a stepping stone to it. So if it's something you might be interested in, it's an opportunity for you. And, that's kind of the end of the presentation right there. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop sharing the screen. And I'm going to just kind of open it up now to questions. Whoever wants to contribute, go ahead. Just start typing your questions away. Okay, so nodal spacing. This comes from Dominique. So nodal spacing is the amount of room that the bud leaves have in order to grow and stretch out. So it's not the bud leaves. It's like the bud as a whole. Nodal spacing, like a nodal site is a place on a cannabis plant where a bud can grow from if nurtured properly, right? So when those nodal spaces are really tight, as the bud grows and the calyxes, which are, the building block of buds, as they start stacking on top of each other, when there's not a lot of room, they necessarily have to be really compact and really dense. And when there's more room, they kind of relax and breathe and open up, and they just grow more open and lighter and more wispy. So yes, it's not about the leaves. It's like the bud as a whole. So as the nodal spacing yeah, the nodal spacing is the amount of room that the buds have to grow and stretch out, pretty much. So, make sure you look at your plants as they're growing, and you can kind of understand what to expect. Where will the classes take place? That is a great question. So on February 2nd, and this is all on my website. If you go to cannabiseducation.co/enroll, and you just click the calendar over to February and check out the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th. The 2nd is in Detroit, and it's at a law firm called like Green Counsel, I think, but let me double check that for you real quick. The 3rd is in Grand Rapids, and that is at a place called Greengate Health. And on the 4th, it's in Lansing, and that's at a place called the Lansing Market, which if you haven't been there and you're a cannabis patient, you should definitely check it out. But on the 2nd, the law firm it's at is called Cannabis Counsel. It's at 2930 East Jefferson Avenue in Detroit. That's going to be from 5 to 8 p.m. And then on the 3rd, Saturday the 3rd, noon to 3 in Grand Rapids. And then on Sunday the 4th, noon to 3 at the Lansing Market. So would love to see you there. If you guys want to sign up for the class, write down this code, all one word, webinar 10. It gets you 10% off. That's going to drop the price from $200 to $180 for you for the class. And, it's a 3-hour class, and you get a bunch of cool stuff. You get the weed wheel here, which is a wheel that shows you the differences between indicas and sativas in a really fun and interactive way. I always leave this out for my Airbnb guests, as well as this, the interpening loop, which helps you identify indica-sativa ratio as well as cannabis quality in one of the coolest folding tools that I've ever gotten a chance to use. And then you also get the interpening guidebook, which is 42 pages, and it takes you through everything that you learn in class through the interpening methodology. And then, one second here, guys. After the class, there's a 35-question test, and if you pass, you get this pin, which is a lot of fun to have. Kathleen, the discount is webinar 10, and I just typed it in there. And actually, while I have you guys, I'm just going to go online and make sure that that is active and ready to go for you guys. Any other questions, guys, about interpening, about the classes, about my background? A lot of people ask me, well, who are you to be teaching me about cannabis, and what can you do for me, and this and that, and does the certification carry any weight? Things of that nature. So, how did I get started in the industry? Thank you for asking. Let's see. I got started in the industry probably as a little kid, as like a 15-year-old, selling pot to my friends so that I could get my weed for free. Pretty much. But really how I got into the industry was I got myself in. I started a website back in 2009 in Denver called strainsource.com, and it was kind of a precursor to Weed Maps and Leafly, and it in essence it crowdsourced strain data on what a product does, because I knew that the blueberry here and the blueberry there and the blueberry over at this other place were different. So I figured that if everyone entered what they thought it was over time, we could kind of get an understanding of like generally what blueberry is, right? And then see what some of the outliers are and maybe ask those people if maybe it's not blueberry and they could change the name. So, I wasn't doing it with genetic testing. I was doing it with crowdsourcing. And ultimately that website got me a lot of relationships with a lot of dispensaries in Colorado. And one day I met a business owner, and he was starting a new company, and he asked me to come and do events and marketing for him. And while I was there, I found out about the Trichome Institute, who I license now the interpreting program from to teach to you guys via my company here in Chicago, the Cannabis Education Company. And I took their test, and I became a level 2 cannabis sommelier. And I ended up working for them for like 2 years, and I still work with them. I go and I grade at the Dope Cup. I go and I help lecture at events all around the country. And I'm also a licensee of theirs. So yeah, I kind of made my way into the cannabis industry myself. All right, Kathleen, do I have any medical background? No, I don't have a medical background aside from self-medicating with cannabis. What I have done is done a lot of research. I read a lot of public medical journal articles about the efficacy of various cannabinoids on certain ailments. I've worked as a patient care consultant for a couple of years and had the opportunity to see how utilizing certain variety types and certain products with certain ailments worked for certain people. And I've helped one human being and 2 dogs make it through some cancer treatments. So those were really rewarding things to get to be a part of. Okay, Nick, once people pass level 2, can they do what I'm doing? Maybe, I don't think that as a level 2 person you can do it. You have to get to level 3 first, and that's something that's kind of between you and Trichome Institute. I didn't become level 3 until I had worked with them for over a year. And, it's not like a thing where I'm training a bunch of people to go out and train and then you give me money and stuff like that. It's not like that. It's more like, if you're really interested in doing this and you want to have a cannabis education business and you want to license materials from the Trichome Institute and pay them their royalties and buy these materials from them on a regular schedule and teach the classes in your area, it is something you could do, but it's going to take working very closely with the Trichome Institute. You might have to go out to Colorado or California and work with them for a while to gain their trust. Or start your own cannabis education business and do your own classes and show them that you're serious about it. It's something that can happen, but I'm not the direct path to it. Okay. What advice, if I can give any, would I give to someone who wants to open a small dispensary? I mean, from what I understand, and I have never owned a dispensary, so I don't know all about the details of the financials of really owning a dispensary, but small dispensaries need to be prepared to not make very much money. I mean, especially in a competitive market, think about it like owning a small liquor store. How much money can someone who owns a small liquor store really make? And liquor stores aren't subject to half the licensing requirements and packaging requirements that dispensaries are. So I would say, be prepared to make it a family business. You're going to be working the counter most of the time. You're probably not going to have any employees really, maybe one. But, if you have the money and it's something you want to do, it's awesome. But I wouldn't expect to make a lot of money or get rich operating one small dispensary. Can what is learned in this course be applied to recommending edibles as well? 5 to mighty. It depends. Because at the end of the day, if you know what variety type of cannabis is in the edible, you'll be able to know what's in there. But if you're just looking at a bunch of edibles and you don't know what kind of cannabis is in it, this doesn't really apply. This program applies really specifically to flower, and analyzing flower. I do have another class on edibles that I'm going to be making available, I believe, as an internet course that you can purchase and get a download code for it, essentially, or a streaming code for it. So, that's something that I have. But if you have a few specific questions that you're curious about with edibles, and you want to shoot me an email to cannabiseducationco@gmail.com, and I'll type that in here for you, cannabiseducationco@gmail.com. If you want to send me an email there, I'll help you out and answer a couple questions. Let's see. All right, guys. Any more questions? See you at the Lansing Market. John, I'll see you at the Lansing Market. I actually am going to try to stop by there on Saturday and shop a little bit. I love that place. It was like, it's an interpreter's dream. Honestly, John, the Lansing Market is an interpreter's dream. Let me tell you why. You walk in, and there is just cultivator after cultivator after cultivator with jars of cannabis, with cardboard signs, with handwritten strain names. And it's like, how do you know or trust any of that? And especially when you start looking at the concentrates, there's a wide range of concentrates there, and some were a lot better than others. And, I would hate for people to get sold products that are subpar. And so that's kind of what interpreting does. And, if you can, John, please pre-register so I know you'll be there, because I always, kind of just bring enough inventory of books and stuff, and usually don't really have people show up and pay at the door. If you can, I'd appreciate it.